Hi, welcome to Synap-Talks from Synapse Uoft. In this podcast, we chat with professionals in the field of neuroscience to learn more about their work, careers, and insights. I'm Gina, a fourth-year student specializing in neuroscience.
And I'm Akroop, a fourth-year student also specializing in neuroscience. Today, our guest is Dr. Hutcherson, Director of the Decision Neuroscience Laboratory and Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Hutcherson has a fascinating interdisciplinary career, combining psychology, neuroscience, and economics to study decision-making processes. With degrees from Harvard and Stanford, postdoctoral research at Caltech, and a deep interest in the philosophical implications of neuroscience, her work bridges science and philosophy in unique ways. Dr. Hutcherson, thank you for speaking with us today. We're honored to learn more about you and your work, so let's jump right in.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's just start off. Tell us a bit more about your background and what inspired you to pursue neuroscience and psychology.
So when I was an undergraduate, I did not expect to be doing psychology. That wasn't anywhere on the radar. I got to college and I thought I wanted either to be an astrophysicist, because I grew up in Montana and the stars were really pretty there. That was my reasoning. Or a French major because I liked studying languages. And in my first year at university, I took a physics class and I hated it. My physics professor was brilliant, but like too brilliant for his own good. So he would sort of like be at the chalkboard scribbling down equations. And then at some point he'd be like, well, I skipped a few steps here, but you see what I mean? And I was like, I don't see what you mean. I don't understand any of this. And so although I still love astronomy and I like looking at stars, I'm very glad I didn't go into that field. It would have been a disaster for me. And then I took a bunch of French classes, but I felt like I liked them, but it wasn't a career. And just as a lark, I had taken introductory psychology in my first year because I was interested. And I think I basically fell in love. Like I just vividly, they talk about like flashbulb memories where it's like you remember where you were. So I remember where I was. Like I remember vividly the video where you're supposed to like count the like basketball passes and like
With the gorilla?
Yeah, with the gorilla. So Dan Simons was the person who did that video, and he was my professor. And I totally did not see the gorilla, and I was like, oh my god. And I think from that moment on, I was addicted. I thought it was such a cool field, and that I felt like I had so many insights, real or illusory, into myself and other people. And so I switched my intention in majoring, and and then the rest is then. I don't know, how much do you want me to answer? Is that good, or should I?
I loved that.
going?
You can continue into Stanford, I guess. What brought you to Stanford?
Yeah, so when I started psychology, I was more interested, I think, in social psychology, actually. I still am. Like, I think my deep interest is in people. And then, what I ended up doing was sort of combining psychology and neuroscience. And I ended up interested in the neuroscience because I was writing a paper in my second year on creativity, which is a very loosey-goosey term. I was like, oh, what makes people creative? And I thought I could answer that question. And so I was researching all of this work on creativity, and I came upon a paper about the relationship between creativity and dreaming. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I started looking a little bit more into dreaming and what dreaming is and whether it serves a function. And I found some like interesting papers. And then I came across this article, which had recently been published, looking at dreaming in rats. So rats have REM sleep just like people do. And the nice thing for humans, the not so nice thing for rats, is that we can stick an electrode into their brain and record what's happening when they're sleeping. And so this paper was doing that, and what they found was that you could record from neurons in the hippocampus, which of course I say, which are thought to encode spatial navigation in the rat, right? So an individual hippocampal neuron will often fire when a rat is running through a maze in exactly the same location in the maze every time. So we call them place cells. And this paper was arguing, they were finding this really interesting stuff where you could see a rat running through a maze, and you could see place cells that would activate sort of in sequence as the rat ran through the maze. And then what ended up happening was at night when the rat is dreaming, in REM sleep, you could see that the same sequence of hippocampal place cells would reactivate in sequence, but basically sped up, as if the rat was sort of replaying this thing in fast forward. And the paper itself was making an argument that, contrary to what you might think, which is that these neurons, that replay should be strengthening in the memory, they were saying that the specific pattern for how they were being replayed might actually serve to erase them. And so the paper was sort of making the nuanced claim that sometimes REM sleep might be used to strengthen memories, and sometimes it might be used to erase memories. And I thought that was such an interesting idea. And I was just blown away by the idea that you could essentially read the mind of a rat, sort of thinking about and re-experiencing these running through a maze, and then this idea that maybe it would have this really important effect on memory, both to strengthen and to erase. And so I sort of fell in love with that idea, and so I started researching actually the role of sleep in erasing. I had this idea that sleep might serve specifically to erase or to help you recover from emotional and traumatic events. And so that was what I wrote my thesis on as a fourth year. And from there, I got really interested in just the role of emotion in decision making. So then I didn't want to do anything else, and so I applied for graduate school in my fourth year. I applied to work with the godfather of emotion regulation, James Gross, because my theory was that there was this burgeoning literature on the role of emotion in decision making. And, contrary to what a lot of people think, which is that emotions make us irrational, there was a lot of work suggesting that emotion actually makes us a better decision maker, right? That in fact, without emotion, we don't make great decisions because they don't guide us in those sort of intuitive ways. And so I thought, naturally, well, if emotion is so important for decision making, then emotion regulation must also be really important for catching those cases where emotion might actually make us irrational. So that's what I wanted to study. So I went and I worked with James Gross, and I also planned to work with a professor who was at Stanford at the time named John Gabrielli, who did the neuroscience side of things. And I got to Stanford, and John Gabrielli immediately left to go to MIT, which made me really sad. But I ended up working with James, who was wonderful. And yeah, that's how I ended up at Stanford.
I loved it. Yeah, that's so fascinating. And every time you spoke about place cells, for example, there were so many different articles that were coming to mind. At first I thought you were talking about the Lavion and colleagues article with closed loop place cells, but then you spoke about REM sleep, and they were investigating in non-REM sleep. So REM, I'm actually not familiar with place cells. A lot of the research I've looked into is during non-REM sleep.
It's true. I think there's a lot of research showing that you get reactivation and different functions of slow wave sleep versus REM sleep versus early sleep, deep sleep, etc.
Yeah, and I think a lot of undergrads go through the same thing of going into their degree thinking one thing, wanting to study French, for example, and even astronomy. I had a dream of becoming an astrophysicist as well until I took physics as well. And then I was like, maybe not. But neuroscience just seemed really fascinating, being the baby of sciences itself. And there's so much to explore within neuroscience, especially with decision making. And we'll get into your course a little bit later. And I think about that class almost every day whenever I am thinking about neuroscience in general and just decision making, and how even the volume of our brain structures deeply impacts how we make decisions. And it's just so fascinating that that is what differentiates so many different characteristics between different people.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's a lot of nuance and all these sort of like topics you end up discovering once you try to hone in on one, but then, you realize that it goes way deeper than that. And so now you have all these other different branches. And so that's one thing that I also really appreciate about the study of neuroscience, is that everything is just so layered at that you can just end up discovering more and more about it. And being that it is an emerging field, right, there's so much still left to discover about it. I think that's one of the things that definitely makes it more definitely exciting. And it's easy to see why you can choose that as your career, and ultimately how easy it is to just dive into that research in that way. And so I guess from there, it's like, so from your research stemming from there, how did that lead into your sort of postdoctoral research from that experience?
Yeah, so I was as a grad student working with James Gross on emotion regulation, and James was a wonderful mentor. He's such a kind human being, and that there's this sort of saying that research is me search, and I think that's often true. And I think there are two flavors of that. I think there are many people who study a topic because they don't do it well. So, for instance, I study decision making because I do it so very poorly. But I think there's another brand of researcher who studies a phenomenon because they don't understand why everybody else doesn't do it as well as they do. So Anthony Wagner studies memory. He's got a brilliant memory, remembers everything. James Gross studies emotion regulation. He's, one of the most well-regulated people I know. Maybe he wouldn't agree. I don't know. But from the outside, he looks so balanced. Anyway, so I was working with James on emotion regulation, and James was primarily a personality and social psychologist, and he had been working a bit with John Gabrielli to do the neuroscience, but that wasn't really his primary interest. And so I always felt just a little bit like there was something missing from what I wanted to do. I loved what I was doing. I thought it was really interesting, but it didn't have the neuroscience component because John Gabrielli had left. And I got to do a little bit of neuroscience, but it wasn't quite where I wanted to be. So my supplement for that was to take these classes in neuroscience and to hope that at some point I might be able to create a connection or do a little bit more than I was doing. And that actually turned out to be the case. So I took a class that was jointly taught by Brian Knudsen, who's still at Stanford and does amazing research on reward and anticipation and the value of reward areas for being able to predict all sorts of interesting things in the world, like the success of movies and Kickstarter campaigns and elections and new brands of cars and all this sort of stuff. And it was taught jointly by him as well as a man named Antonio Rangel, who was an economist. And Antonio, absolutely brilliant man, and he talked a lot about the math behind economics. And he obviously loved economics in the way that I love psychology and neuroscience. Antonio is this 6'3", 300-pound Spaniard, right? With everything that you would think that would entail. So he's incredibly charismatic and a really great teacher. And so he talked a lot about the math and then showed how the math. So for instance, there's a very simple set of equations in neuroscience and economics and psychology for things like how do we learn about rewards? How do we learn what's good and bad? So many of you may be familiar with it. It's called reinforcement learning. You have prediction errors, and you use that to update values of reward. It's really like 2 or 3 lines of math, and it has all of these really interesting implications for how we learn and when we don't learn. And all of that really was developed in sort of the computer science and the information science and the economics literature. But then it turned out that at some point people, Wolfram Schultz in particular, found these neurons in the brain that looked like they were doing that equation, basically, right? Their responses were exactly in line with the predictions of this reinforcement learning mechanism. And then, similarly, when we make choices, as many of you who have taken my class know, we think that the way people make choices is by gathering evidence about for or against different options under consideration until the evidence is overwhelming enough to cross a threshold for choice. And Antonio talked in really glorious detail about the evidence that the brain has neurons whose activity looks very much like the predictions of these models. And again, one of those like light bulb moments where you're like, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. That's really amazing. Again, these like equations that are like 2-3 lines long, but you can play them out in all of these different ways. They make incredibly precise predictions. And then it looks like the brain's doing that. And I just sort of thought that confluence of all of these different pieces of computer science and math and psychology and decision-making and neuroscience just was really incredible. I was like, I want to do that. So I went to Antonio and I said, I'd really love to do something with you. Would you be willing? And he was like, yes, of course. So I started to put together a proposal for what I wanted to do, which had to do with how we make trade-offs between pluses and minuses. And Antonio was like, I love it, let's start. And I was like, great. And then I think maybe 17 hours later, Antonio sent another email and was like, I'm sorry, I can't do this, I'm moving to Caltech. I was like, oh, yeah, I was not expecting that. So I was like, okay, well, it's been nice knowing you. I guess we won't do this work together. And that was indeed true. And then, so he left for Caltech, and in the meantime, I continued on as a grad student at Stanford, but still always feeling that like that piece of my heart was kind of a little bit missing. And so when I came to the end of my grad school days, I still wanted to be in psychology. I still wanted to be in neuroscience, and so I emailed him. And oftentimes when you're about to graduate, you email lots of people about the possibility of a postdoc. And usually you don't email like everybody. You start with one and then probably don't get a response and then find somebody else. So I emailed Antonio, not really expecting anything. Immediately got a reply, which was like, yes, when can you come down? And I was like, well, I still have like a year or two left on my graduate degree. I was sort of just throwing out a tentative like trial balloon. But I can come down whenever. He was like, how about next week? I was like, oh, okay. So I went down and I sort of talked about what I wanted to do. And he was like, you're hired. And I was like, well, but I still have to graduate. So indeed, it took another year or two for me to graduate. But then I had this postdoc, so I went down to Caltech. And then I finally got to do the things that I was super passionate about doing. And it was such an incredible experience. And as I said, like Antonio is one of the most brilliant and passionate people you'll meet. And he attracted a lot of brilliant and passionate people as well. So it was just such an incredibly vibrant lab with people who eventually became some of my best friends in the world, who I love dearly to this day. So that's how I finally ended up doing everything that put my heart together, and I basically haven't looked back since.
That's so sweet and so inspiring to hear that story and see that someone had so much belief in you before you were even graduated and ready to move.
Yeah, well,
move
that's
on
Antonio
from
for you. He is 150%. Yeah,
that is amazing, and it's very inspiring to hear. Especially as like a lot of our viewers, a lot of people listening to this are looking into grad school and maybe even postdoc degrees, and just hearing that is so inspiring, because once you know it's right, it is right. You're in the right place and you've found your calling, and Antonio was able to give that to you. I guess aside from this, are there any other memorable moments in your academic experience and your academic journey that you'd like to share?
I mean, there are lots of them. Narrow it down for me. There are so many.
I guess the first things that come to mind, because for me, when I think back, I mean, I've still been in my undergrad, but when I think back to like the most memorable times, they're in my first year when I had just met all of my friends. I just moved away from home, making big adjustments to my life. But those are the ones I remember the most. And then also, even now in my semester currently, I feel like I've grown so much as a student and aspiring neuroscientist.
Yeah.
I've been pushed out of my comfort zone so far, and I haven't looked back. I feel very content with where I'm at now as a student. And these are even the moments that are just so, I will remember these for a long time.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, as you're talking, I'm flashing back to all of those same kinds of moments for me, which, you know, some of them were about the academics. You know, you've asked me a lot about sort of the intellectual journey, but you're totally right that a lot of them are about the personal. I don't know how personal I would get. I guess one moment that I guess I'll share. It was illegal at the time. It's not illegal now. So, you know, my first year as a graduate student, I also met in the same way that when I became a postdoc in Antonio's lab, I just met a whole bunch of people who became instantly some of my best friends in the world. The same was true when I got to grad school, of course, because, you know, you attract such like-minded people. So I'd sort of getting to know a bunch of folks in the social and the cognitive and the personality areas at Stanford who were also all grad students. And I was very naive as a young woman, I guess. You know, I grew up in Montana. I never had done drugs. I'd never been drunk. Name any of the vices. I just had not done any of them. Even in undergrad, I fell in with, again, a bunch of people who became some of my best friends, but we were all like total nerds. And like our idea of a really good time on a weekend was to like rent 3 movies from Blockbuster Video, which still existed at the time, and then just to marathon these like dumb movies about sci-fi and then go to bed. So, you know, weren't drinking, weren't smoking, weren't doing drugs, weren't, you know, partying or whatever. And I got to Stanford, and like it's a bit more of a party school than Harvard was. Not that Harvard doesn't have parties, but Stanford was a bit more, maybe just because the weather's nicer. So my recollection was the first time I sort of really hung out with these social graduate students, and one of them had quite a lot of weed. And of course I was like, well, I guess why not try it? Again, it was like totally illegal at the time. But we ended up out on so Stanford has this big grassy lawn in front of a beautiful, beautiful building. Stanford is one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, I think, just objectively speaking. Anyway, so we were smoking out there, and then somebody got the brilliant idea to go into the psych building and smoke there. And I was like, this seems like a really terrible idea, but of course, you know, I went along with it. And so we ended up in the lobby of the psych building, and there was this a big staircase where it sort of went up halfway between the 2 floors, turned around, and then came, you know, one of these big sort of almost like spiral staircases, but not quite. And so it had this big landing, and you could actually crawl under the landing. There was about maybe 4 feet of space or something under this landing that was in the lobby. So we ended up crawling under there because when you've smoked a lot of weed, you think all sorts of ideas that are not great ideas are really, really fun. So we crawled under there, and we're like smoking it up and giggling and, you know, doing all the things that you do when you're getting to know people and are totally uninhibited. And then it was like midnight or something on a Friday or a Saturday night or something, and we all thought we were so cool, like smoking. It was so naughty smoking in the psych department, and one of the faculty came in at midnight, obviously to go work because that's what they do. And we were all like, oh, shoot, I can't say this. Uh-oh. And so we all were like, don't say anything. And then I don't know. I mean, it's not like weed isn't noticeable. So I don't know how this faculty member didn't notice that we were there. But he walked by as if he didn't notice and just kept going. And then of course after that, we didn't get in trouble. Nobody found us. And then we sort of escaped and hung out elsewhere. But those sorts of things are burned into my brain as well. Just the moments where you sort of bond with people doing things you shouldn't or doing things you should or having fun. And yeah, I've got lots of thoughts like that. So
yeah, those definitely are, I think, the most memorable parts of just when you meet new people, especially when you do transition into university and graduate studies. I think it's those moments that really, like you say, stick with you and build one of the strongest bonds you can. Even if it it might not directly be part of your like you said, your academic journey, but it's those little moments that meeting new people, building those connections through these memories that make it all worthwhile.
I think that's something that people often underestimate. I think science actually is, people often have this view of the lone scientist brilliantly coming up with ideas on his or her or their own. But science, I think, much more so is a social endeavor. Part of the reason I'm interested in social psychology and social neuroscience. And that's true, oftentimes you end up doing research with your friends and you end up doing it because you're, whatever, shooting the breeze over drinks somewhere. And you're like, oh, wouldn't this be interesting? Or isn't this funny? And then you're like, we should do that. So I have more than one paper and more than one friend who I wasn't really friends with before, but we ended up just chatting over drinks or something. And we're like, oh, that's an interesting, let's do that. And then we worked together and we became friends. So I think oftentimes you think, oh, these social moments aren't part of the academic experience. They sit outside. But I think for many, if not most people, they aren't out there. They're an integral part of the process. And probably if you asked many people some of the most groundbreaking papers that they wrote, you'd find that at that seed of it is some social moment that they experienced that probably involves smoking weed with somebody somewhere or something similar.
Do you have an example of that paper?
For me, the paper of something that turned into and still is a research project of mine. And again, one of those moments that sort of gets burned into your brain. It was right before the pandemic, actually, and so a colleague of mine and a friend of mine at Toronto had just gotten tenure. And when I say right before the pandemic, I mean March 11th or 10th or 12th, something like that. So COVID was very clearly on the horizon, but nothing had been shut down yet. And so my friend had just gotten tenure and had a tenure party at a hotel where, it was a big bar and there were, I don't know, maybe 20 of us or something all celebrating tenure. But, as academic nerds, there's nothing better than being told you get to do this for the rest of your life. And nobody can stop you ever again. So we were all celebrating, and I was chatting with somebody who, he was just on the cusp of what I would call friend, right? Somebody who you've hung out with a bit. You wouldn't necessarily call him up to say, hey, let's go. But if you saw him with other people, you'd be like, oh, hey. Actually, as part of my teaching for Psych 13, social cognition, I had put together a unit on all of this really fascinating psychological research on how how physical disease, how pathogens and parasites may have shaped human psychology. And so I was sort of interested in that. And as a function of that, because COVID was on the horizon, was, just sort of like speculating about how the potential pandemic would shape human psychology over the next year or two. And this guy, Igor Grossman, professor at Waterloo, is a cultural psychologist who has done also some work on how pathogen prevalence and pathogen stress may have shaped cultural differences, right? Because there are big differences in disease threat across the globe, and we think that people evolve behavioral responses to deal with that. And so he's actually done some work on this. So the two of us were just kind of like, just sort of having fun, speculating about what psychology could tell us about how human psychology would be affected by the pandemic. Would we become more xenophobic and more racist? Would we be depressed? Would we become more traditionalist, right? There's some really interesting things about gender conformity and the idea that when you're under high pathogen threat, people value traditionalism and gender conformity more than they do when there's no threat. So we were just kind of like, and then, as I said, and it was over drinks and then we were like, oh, we're basically saying that we as psychologists have interesting predictions about how society will unfold over the next year or two, like very interesting predictions. We should ask if we're right. And we should ask whether other psychologists share our predictions. Like, would they all say the same thing or would they say different things? And then would they be better at predicting what will happen than normal people who don't have a psychology education? And so we were like, okay, well, let's study it. Let's just ask a whole bunch of psychologists what they think will happen over the next year or two. Let's ask a whole bunch of random people what they think will happen. Depression, anxiety, loneliness, racism, you name it. Just say what you think will happen, how much you think things will change. Do you think they'll go up or do you think they'll go down? And then we said, well, we need to know whether we're right or wrong. So then and it turns out that making those predictions is super, super easy, but asking whether they're correct is very, very hard because that data often isn't collected. Or it's not collected in the right way because you need to have the same measure multiple times with enough data that you actually have a good sample. You can be very, if you want to make societal claims, you have to have enough people. So we embarked on what seemed like a really simple question. Can psychologists make accurate predictions about something as big as how the pandemic will affect human psychology? And it turned into this much bigger project than we had anticipated. But in the end, we were kind of able to do a little of this research. And the answer was psychologists are really terrible at making these predictions. Like, they're barely above what you'd expect by chance. They're not really better than lay people, maybe a little bit if you squint. And then we did a whole bunch of research on like what are the predictors that actually make you better at doing these predictions accurately. So that was, all of that research, which now has resulted in 3 or 4 publications and also has been picked up by people in a number of different disciplines. We have an historian who we're working with to sort of share our insights with historians who are starting to get interested in this idea of can you use history to both predict in the future, but also even just to understand the past and to predict things that aren't really known about the past but might someday be. So all of that, it's really, the research has expanded. It's an incredibly interesting topic. And, as a function of that, I also became much closer friends with Igor Grossman, who's just also an incredibly vivacious, interesting person. So yeah, all of that was like just kind of getting drinks together and chatting and joking and then being like, oh, actually, that's an interesting idea.
I love how friendships unfold that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so nice to see that snowball effect really, really picked up. You had one interesting idea concept and it turned into publications. There are people around the world who are interested in it. There are people who are picking it up and doing further research. And what you brought up about history is so important to touch on. Like, history can be used to understand the past and the future. Yeah. It's just so interesting, those interdisciplinary fields, how you bring everything in together. And I guess that brings me into my next question about neuroeconomics.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach integrating psychology, neuroscience, and economics in your research?
Very carefully and with trepidation. No. Yeah. So doing interdisciplinary work it's a funny space to be working in because it's both really, really easy and really, really hard. It's really, really easy because, all you have to do is be like, well, why don't we combine these two ideas and just see what happens? And that's not hard to do when it's a new interdisciplinary field that people haven't been doing. And you're like, oh, look at this idea from this field. We could tell economists about it and maybe they'd be interested. Or maybe more often, you're like, oh, look at this idea in economics. We can go see if there's something in the brain that looks like that. So that's not hard to do, roughly speaking. But it is really hard to do it well. And then it's really hard to convince people that they should care about this. Because, of course, psychologists are like, we're not economists. Why do we care about this? And economists are like, we're not psychologists. Psychologists don't use math. What do they have to say? Who cares about the brain? Like, we care about people. Why do you need to know anything about the brain to know what people are doing? And oftentimes the answer is, well, I guess you probably don't. But, as a neuroeconomist, you're unwilling to give up on this idea that there is something meaningful and crucial about knowing something about the brain. So how do you do that? I think the answer is you try to read widely and you try to really understand these different disciplines kind of on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And then there will be places where, as a psychologist, you're like, I don't understand why you think that. Why would that be your assumption? And then the economists will look back at you and be like, I don't understand why you think the way you do. Why would that be your assumption, right? So like economists often are, all about rationality. What is the right choice to make? What is the choice that will improve people's welfare? And they have all these theories about how and why people should make choices that make them better off. And then as a psychologist, you're like, but people don't do that. People make all of these other choices that according to your theories are like demonstrably wrong. But, if you think from a biological standpoint, if you think from an evolutionary standpoint, and oftentimes if you just think from a human standpoint, they're not wrong. They're just correct in a larger picture. And so I think oftentimes it's sort of the research kind of jumps out at you when you encounter those moments where you're like, I don't understand why you think this. And they're like, well, I don't understand why you think this. And you say, well, let's bridge that. Let's find a way to translate your perspective into ours and our perspective into yours and see if there's a way that we're both right or a way that we're both wrong. Either answer would be interesting and we'd learn something. So that's typically how I've done it. And, as I've mentioned, that there oftentimes, like for me, I'll get ideas about things that I want to study by teaching things in class, right? You'll learn a little bit deeper about something. And then oftentimes for me, these ideas are often like, I'll have been teaching something for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden I'll encounter something and I'll be like, oh, I wonder if that's related to that. And then you're like, well, let me go study it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very fantastic insight that you gave, because especially when considering interdisciplinary research, like there's definitely a lot to sort of not only look at, but also kind of hone in on what really is interesting and how you can bridge the gap. I think that's definitely probably one of the largest challenges you can face, especially in disciplines that are so widely or just so far apart in what they focus in on. But I think that that's also how we can answer some of the more bigger questions, right? Especially how decision making falls. I think that's the big bridge there, is that decision making is the key for both of those disciplines, and that can definitely lead into some great insight in, like, not just in ourselves, but also just in people in general. And it's definitely applicable. And so I guess a follow-up question for how you sort of tackle that sort of challenges. How do you stay inspired to continue to work on these big questions and combine these disciplines in your research?
Can I be really trite and just say you guys?
Oh.
Teaching, oftentimes when you have been doing this for a really long time, we know that people like unexpected. We know that people like exciting. We know that people like new things that cause prediction errors. And if you've been in the field for a really long time, it can start to be hard to encounter real prediction errors for yourself. But that's not true of you guys, because you're coming to it for the first time. The best days for me are when I can see somebody's eyes go, oh, and I'm like, I just blew your mind, didn't I? And that's really exciting. But then, you'll get these great questions from people and you'll be like, oh, I actually don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. We should study that. And so I think that's one of the ways that I stay inspired. And then another, I think, is just, I think it's always important to stay alive to the mystery of people. I find people deeply confusing. Not entirely. Like, it's often easy in retrospect to explain people's behavior, but I also often am just totally wrong in my predictions. And I think it's easy just to pass that off as, oh, they're behaving, like I said, like they're behaving irrationally. I don't have to explain their behavior because it's wrong. But I think when we have deeper respect for people, and I think this is, to me as a psychologist, this is a lesson that oftentimes economists really could, if they really think about it, grasp from psychology and neuroscience, is that almost always when people behave in a way that is quote unquote irrational, that we don't understand, the behavior makes sense from a larger perspective. And so I think, it's easy. I think it's often easy to like I said, to kind of get inured to when people do things that you don't understand and just be like, oh, they're crazy, they're dumb, they're bad people, they're X, Y, and Z, and I don't have to explain it. But when you stop and say, no, I really should understand why that behavior makes sense in their world, why for them they thought that was the right choice, or maybe they didn't even think it was the right choice, but it was, when you take into account these other very subtle environmental contexts, or unconscious, or long-term or short-term, all of these things, right? And so I think oftentimes I think the way I stay inspired is just by noticing when I find myself being like, I don't understand that doesn't make sense, and then being tempted to dismiss it and saying, no, don't dismiss that. Figure out why that's happening. It can lead to all sorts of questions, and science is built on questions. So yeah.
I want to know a little bit more about your lab here at U of T, the Toronto Decision Neuroscience Lab.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about what you're doing and how students take part in that, and what's been the most rewarding part of leading your lab?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Toronto Decision Neuroscience Lab is, I'm like a very small percentage of it, actually, right? So there are lots of people who are in the lab, from undergraduates to graduate students to postdoctoral fellows, and also participants. So what does our lab look like? Well, everybody, I hope, in the lab is sort of oriented around trying to ask research questions that ideally are interesting, important. We've got, depending on how you count, 4 or 5 graduate students, half a dozen to a dozen undergraduates, a postdoc or two. And then lots of collaborators at other universities who, while they technically wouldn't fall under the Decision Neuroscience Lab, I still think of as like sort of the extended lab. What are we doing? we're trying to understand why people make the decisions they do, why they make decisions they regret, and how we can make decisions better. We study decision making at all levels. We use neuroscience to do that. So we use computational modeling to do that. We use eye tracking to do that. And increasingly, we're starting to use passive mobile sensing and data collection in real life to do that. And almost all of the questions that we ask end up boiling down to this sort of problem of self-control, which is that it's no accident that I said, study decisions that you think feel irrational and then understand why they're not. Because self-control really ends up boiling down to that question. Why do I keep making decisions that ultimately I regret? And sometimes I even make those decisions knowing I'm going to regret it, and I can't stop myself. So we're trying to explain that with the research that we do. So we do a lot of laboratory studies where we try to get people to fail at self-control in the lab, which turns out to be really hard. And it's often not clear whether that failure in the lab translates to the real world. But, we ask them to make decisions about junk foods and whether they want to eat it or whether they don't, whether they want to eat like raw but healthy broccoli or, delicious pizza and Snickers bars. And then we look at what goes on neurally with EEG. We use eye tracking to see what they're looking at. We, as I said, develop these computational models. So we try to essentially, increasingly with AI, artificial intelligence, people are, you can kind of recapitulate people's behavior without doing anything other than just telling the chatbot, do what people do. But sometimes it's not clear as what insight you gain from that. I think oftentimes the best place for studying these behaviors is this middle ground where you have a very simple model, which is obviously wrong, but is describable and pokeable. You can manipulate it. You can put pieces in and you can take pieces out that you know what you're doing. And so we do a lot of that. So trying to build these models that will kind of recapitulate human behavior, and especially human behavior that looks irrational but really isn't. And I think maybe one of the things I'm most excited about that we're doing right now is this stuff that I mentioned about mobile tracking of decision making. So I think during the pandemic, I sort of had, and just after I got tenure during the pandemic, which was really sad because, whereas my colleague who I mentioned had a big tenure party with everybody. When I got tenure, it was actually illegal for more than two people to be together at once. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just sit here and drink a glass of wine or something. But it's not uncommon for people once they get tenure to kind of go through a midlife research crisis. And so I kind of did, and I was like, I love all this laboratory stuff. It's really clean. But it really isn't clear that it says anything about the real world. And real world decision making is so much messier and more interesting and harder to study, but I want to study it. And so one of my graduate students, Daniel Wilson, was also deeply interested in this question and was interested in what is often referred to as the intention behavior gap. So we set goals for ourselves, right, where we're like, I'm going to write that paper today. I'm going to go exercise for half an hour. I'm going to make dinner instead of ordering in on Uber Eats or whatever it is. And then we don't do it. So there's a gap between what we wanted to do and what we actually did. So he's interested in that. And I am interested in why there are daily fluctuations in that. So maybe you guys don't experience this, but I certainly know that on some days, there's just something about my brain that works and everything is just fluent, and I'm responding to student emails and I'm getting stuff done, and I'm I think I'll do that thing that I've been putting off for 6 months, and then it takes 5 minutes and I'm why didn't I do this earlier? And then in the evening I'm what, I think I'll go for a run because I just feel like it. And then of course there are the other days, maybe more common, where everything just feels like molasses, and I want to work. I'm sitting and staring at the computer and nothing's happening. So I was really interested in that. And there are big debates in psychology and neuroscience about whether that's a thing, what that thing is. Is it just motivation? Are you just I don't feel like it? Or is there something about your brain's cognitive function or what have you that's like driving these fluctuations. And so we've been doing some work to try to get at that. So we have a big study where we track people through for 3 months, and every day we ask them, how'd you do with your goals? And then we also have a bunch of little tasks that allow us to measure things like cognitive and motivational function and decision making, and to model them and to create these computational decomposition into different components of cognitive and decision function. And so we've just gotten some results from that. It's really exciting. Yes, this cognitive fluctuation like seems to be a thing. Like there are some days on which people's brains work better, and they get more stuff done, and we can track it and we can predict it. We can explain it, and it's not explainable by other things, although it is influenced by other things, for sure. So I think that it's a really exciting place to be. There are lots of questions, and now we'll use neuroscience and computational modeling and behavior to unpack it. Does that answer?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I can't wait for you to and your team to come up with an answer to that, because I definitely experienced that.
Yeah.
Even today, like yesterday was one of my top productive days.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And today, I'm trying to be just as productive. I wouldn't say this is a very unproductive day. I mean, we're here with you as well, getting to check that off our bucket list. But there are definitely days where there's nothing to be done. And in my head, those days are more like, I need this if I want to have those very productive days.
Yeah, and we're finding that too. So I think, they're really interesting. Like people are very clearly sensitive to this. So on days where they're cognitively good, they set more ambitious goals for themselves the next day.
Yeah.
The next day, like if they're cognitively up, like the effort that's required to do it doesn't matter as much. Like it doesn't stop you from doing it. And it raises really interesting questions. Like if you knew that today was just not a good day and you decided to do things that were easy, would you get those done because they are easy and then feel good about yourself? If we could tell people, hey, just don't try anything complicated today and forgive yourself, would that help? So those are some of the questions that we're really interested in.
Yeah, there's so much to dive into from there. Very excited to find all of those out.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've also found that a lot of times when we do set out these ambitious goals, and a lot of it, I think, from personal experience, also has to do with sort of the urgency of these goals,
Yes.
and sort of how that factors into when we not only decide to make these goals, but also when we decide to actually complete them and put in that effort to get those results for that. And I think, as my co-host mentioned earlier, that they found yesterday to be much more productive. I think I'm the opposite for this week. I'm finding today to be much more productive. And just looking back also, you can see that comparison, I think, as well, when you do have those fluctuations, just putting a comparison on those days like you described. And so one of the questions I think that our listeners would want to know is there's a lot to unpack in neuroscience research, evidently. Just seeing how diverse not only PIs as yourself can decide to explore, but also the opportunities that everyone else can choose to follow as well. What advice would you have for any students or our listeners who feel overwhelmed by the complexity of neuroscience and that often worry about their lack of experience before they or during even approach the field?
Yeah, it's a really important question because it's easy to feel overwhelmed. I mean, I feel overwhelmed oftentimes. I think there's no one answer to that. So the first thing I would say, and this actually just comes straight out of social psychology. When you have a big goal that you want to achieve and it feels overwhelming, break it into much, much, much smaller goals. So you feel overwhelmed by neuroscience. Okay, great. That's fine. You want to get into it, but you don't know how. Okay, great. Talk to another student. Ask them what they did. Ask them if they have suggestions. email a faculty member. It's easy to just send them an email and say, I'm interested in getting involved. Tell me what to do. And most faculty members have no shortage of things that they want people to do that are easy to do and will get you in. And then, I think oftentimes when we're trying to educate ourselves, it's really hard because we don't know where to start and we don't even know how to figure out what we don't know. But, people spend their lifetimes learning and becoming experts. And so, often, when you're looking for the shortest path somewhere, right? Like I'm just thinking about like when you're on a big lawn, right? And, people will like prepare the sidewalks and be like, walk here. And then you see this very straight path going right through the grass where they obviously don't want you to walk, but it's obviously the shortest path there. The same thing is true in neuroscience, right? Don't necessarily take all of these paths where people are like, first read this chapter and then this chapter and then this chapter. Just ask people, well, how did you get there? What books did you read? Where did you go to do that? And almost always that's like the straightest, fair, they will have done all of that exploration for you and be like, don't waste your time with this. So that's what I would say. And again, it goes back to science being a social endeavor. Don't try to do it alone. Get advice, and just take a step. It doesn't have to be the right one. I think the real key is just keep moving. Read, and I'd even say, I think for me, like again, one of these formative experiences, a lot of the ways that I got into neuroscience was reading popular press neuroscience books. So I read, I think the first one I read that like very clearly had that light bulb moment for me was, I think it's called Phantoms in the Brain by a neuroscientist named V.S. Ramachandran. And it's all about phantom limb syndrome, right? Where people will lose a limb, but then, claim that they feel that limb's still there. And it turns out there's a really interesting neuroscientific explanation for why. But it was sort of like halfway between a popular book and a neuroscience book, but it was accessible, right? It's written simply. It comes up with a few key things that are really cool, and it gets you excited, and it gives you a place to start. And so I would say, there are a bunch of books out there like that are kind of readable, digestible, give you a place to start. You don't need to be an expert in neuroscience to get them, or, same with psychology. There are a bunch of popular psych books at this point that are very accessible. So I'd say, if you really don't know where to start, don't start with a textbook, which is going to be dry and very dense, full of facts that, are dubiously important. Start with somebody who's really trying to sell you. They'll tell you the interesting things, and then you can branch out from there.
Thank you. I loved all of those answers. There were so many points that you made that I was just stuck with. And I definitely think that I'm going to revisit this podcast for sure, take in all of that again. But I know that a lot of people listening in, there are so many moments during your academic career, I'm sure that you can attest to this as well, where you just may feel like lost.
Mm-hmm.
As much as you feel like you're on the right path, or I can't give up now, I've come so far.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just need that little light bulb, and just finding a little bit of inspiration, like you said, with a book. Sometimes it's an article. Sometimes it is just having those social interactions with friends. I have so many friends that will just sit down and we're talking. We'll just be going through a lecture, and we'll just be wondering, why not this? I wonder if it's this way. Even coming up with like mnemonics, the way that we study with one another, it's so interesting, but it makes it enjoyable, and it keeps you there. It keeps you with your dreams and your goals, and it prevents you from giving up too early. I think that that's one of the things that I've noticed. A lot of peers that I started out with who aren't in this degree anymore or in the major specializing neuroscience anymore is they gave up. And while everyone's path is different and leads us all to different places, it's really inspirational to see someone who just continued and stayed with it, and that there is a future. I mean, there's no lack of job security in neuroscience. There's so much to do with it. There's so many questions to answer. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for all of that. We're going to hit you with the rapid fire questions.
Okay. All right.
I guess we'll alternate. going
Yeah,
through these. You can
all
start.
right, I'll begin with a rapid fire phase then. So just you can answer completely honestly about these. One word or one sentence answers are fine with this. So what is your favorite season?
Spring.
What's one thing you can't start your day without?
Coffee.
Favorite brain structure?
Ooh, well, my favorite name is Substantia Innominata, which is literally the name that translates as unnamed substance. And my actual favorite brain region is the medial prefrontal cortex, which is also my email address.
I didn't guess that one. I totally thought it was going to be the nucleus accumbens.
I mean, the nucleus accumbens is fine. The medial prefrontal cortex is where it's at.
Oh, yeah. Favorite neuroscience experiment of all time?
Oh, wow. I don't have a rapid fire answer to that. No, okay. I guess favorite just in the, it's not actually the best neuroscience, but Antonio Damasio's work with the Iowa gambling deck and ventromedial prefrontal cortex patients who like couldn't learn to avoid these really terrible decks. Again, like I think there are alternative interpretations for what he found, but maybe just as like a formative study, I'd say something like that. I'm probably going to regret my answer later, and I'll be like, no, I should have said this one. But yeah.
Yeah. Most exciting place you've traveled for research?
For research, Switzerland. Yeah.
If you could instantly master any skill, what would it be?
That's a great question. Well, so I play the violin. I play it like halfway decently. If I could play it like actually well, maybe I'd do that. I wouldn't mind instantly mastering some form of martial art so I can defend myself in the coming apocalypse. Is flying a skill? Can I master flying?
I would love to learn how to
Definitely.
fly.
Done. Okay, those are my three.
I love it.
What's one thing you tell your undergrad self?
Don't go to Stanford. That's terrible. I had a great time at Stanford, but my undergrad self also had an opportunity to go study at UCLA with Matt Lieberman, and Matt was doing really like directly what I wanted to do. He wanted to do he's doing social neuroscience, and I went to Stanford because James and John Gabriele I thought would do that for me, but neither one of them were actually doing what I wanted to do. They were just combining it, and Stanford gave me more money. So I was like, more money, and I can do mostly what I want to do. And it turned out fine. I'm happy with where I'm at, but I have very few places where I regret, and I'm like, oh, I probably should have done something else. But that's one of them. That's what I tell my undergrad self. But that's very particular to me.
Yeah. What's the best compliment you've received from a student?
Wow. Well, this is the thing that pops to mind is actually, it's not actually a compliment. I think the thing that made me most happy that a student said once, in my very first year as a professor, he came to me, he was a research assistant in my lab, and he came to me and he said, Professor Hutcherson, I'm really sorry. I have something to tell you. And I was like, oh, okay, what's going on? He looked really, really miserable. And he was like, he was working on a study for me, and I had given him some MATLAB code to go through. And he was like, I found a bug in your code. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And this was code that I'd had for years. And he looked so terrified of what I was going to say. But to me, that was like the best moment, the best compliment he could have paid me. because it meant he'd actually like learned enough to go beyond me, right? He like figured out something I'd done wrong, and I was like, oh my God, that's so amazing. And I don't know, it wasn't meant to be a compliment, but I took it as one because I'd gotten him to the point where he could do better than I could.
No, I love that. There's one that I didn't write down that I actually want to ask. Who's your favorite neuroscientist, dead or alive?
That's a great question. I mean, there are lots of folks who come to mind. I guess maybe I'll say Liz Phelps, because she was one of the first women neuroscientists. She worked with Joe Ledoux and just sort of opened up the amygdala as an area to study, and she is just incredibly strong and really smart and just always on top of her game. And I remember when I first started as a professor in 2015, and I was at a summer institute for neuroeconomics in Shanghai, of all places. And Liz Phelps was lecturing at this place. And I think she must have been like 50, 55 at the time or something. She showed up pregnant.
Oh, okay.
And it was obvious that, she must have really planned that one. And I was just like, damn, girl, you go. So not only is she like incredibly prolific and shaped the field, but she was also just like rocking it, like personally in some ways. And so, maybe like just in terms of like all around, like, wouldn't I love to be that at 55? Maybe Liz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hutcherson. I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Great insight. I think we covered a lot of things that even our listeners would definitely appreciate you for sharing here today on the podcast with us.
Yeah. And I learned so much about you beyond just one course that I had with you. It really
weed in the
No, I took away a lot from just your academic journey as well, as someone who's just really excited about what the future can hold in neuroscience and just post-grad in general.
And I want to follow up on something you said, which I think is also really important. It's easy to say, but you're right that one of the keys to succeeding is just not giving up. That's how I got here. I went through many years where I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm not succeeding. I'm not getting where I want to go. And if I'd given up, I'm sure I would have led a great life somewhere else doing something else, but it wouldn't be this. So,
Yeah. Even now, there are moments where I'm like, is this really what I want? And then I open up a little paper about CFOS or something, and it changes the way I feel.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone listening in. See you next time.